right, so welcome back to Modern Idealist podcast. I'm Valerie Leung.
And I'm Meryn, and we have a very exciting episode today. So we're coming to you from, well, not quite from, but we'll tell you that in a minute, the Nobel Peace Center in conjunction with Oslo Innovation Week. So we were just there recently and had a few little malfunctions. So we're doing a take two. So that's why you can find us on the video, but we still have some great snaps from the day. What we're doing is we're really talking a lot about change making, peace, and where innovation lies in all of this. And we have a very exciting guest that we're going to introduce you to. Valerie and I, we've been discussing these topics basically since long before the inception of Modern Idealists. And I think for us, it's really important to think of how do we re-find our sense of humanity in a digital age. We have, some of the biggest conflicts, genocide, capitalism gone enormously wrong, the increase of fascist governments, etc. And these kinds of huge political and socio and geopolitical issues at our fingertips, essentially. And we're finding ourselves stuck in the middle of it whilst being so far away with it. And where do we find ourselves? Where do we find community? How do we, maintain a sense of self and control when everything seems entirely out of control? So that's going to be very much what we talk about today. How do we straddle those two worlds when it comes to understanding and what our part is in humanitarian issues, whilst seemingly trying to get on with business, which doesn't make sense without moral ambition, Valerie, because I know this is something that you've been reflecting on and just, thinking about the paradoxes. So I'd love to discuss a bit of that before we bring our amazing guest on.
I love that you basically highlighted that, that we've been talking about this before. It's weird because I've been seeing on Instagram, there's these reels of basically girlfriends. And she's like, find yourself a girlfriend. It's somebody who you go to pop concerts with, but then at the same time on the backside of that, you're discussing humanity in the digital age. And that's our friendship. And I love that. All things traversing innovation, change making, peace, and, for us, all of it. And I think even more so, our sense of agency. I've been on the personal responsibility. I reflect, that's how I've been thinking about it. And I thought responsibility leads to action. I don't think that's true for everybody. And, I'm maybe in my vent mode right now, but that's why we're here. First step is, yes, finding our personal responsibility is really important. And some of it isn't really our personal responsibility, as in we're not the, reason why something happened. I think people kind of misunderstand responsibility sometimes like that. But I think taking responsibility can just be, I'm a person who's enjoying the system at the end of the day. I make a good living. I live well. I have security, not just financial security. I have security, and I think defense is one of the big things everyone's talking about nowadays. We have security, financial security. I've got a family, I've got a little one now. And I'm just thinking all of that is possible because I'm somehow one of the beneficiaries of the system. There are moments when I'm not. If I'm benefiting, then is somebody paying for this? And then, once I ask those questions, I can learn more. And then once I learn more about my responsibility of it all, then there's a sense of overwhelmness and paralysis, and I can't do anything. But paralysis no more. Not to say that I'm like that every day. There's so many days I can't get out of that. But in general, this chapter is paralysis no more. It's about our sense of agency. We can do something. And the important thing is doing something makes a change in my life. You can have the discussion of, does my action actually have a bigger effect? Maybe, maybe not. But if I don't feel that deep down inside as well, then it's never going to actually happen. And if I can't do that as a testament as a person, then I don't know if another person can do that. And it's not until many of us, thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of us feel that way, until we can actually have momentum on something. So bringing it back to this episode, this is us dedicating time in true MI, Modern Idealist. Yes, we've coined ourselves at this point. MI style will be traversing the crossroads of innovation, impact, and our personal agency, exploring, what we can do to show up in this world in a world that's simultaneously advancing, like we keep saying, and crumbling around us. And we want to explore, those complexities. Yes, they're very difficult. Yes, they feel like there are many things happening at one time. And so,
Mm.
what can we do to create that change? And I'm so happy to bring on our friend and guest speaker who will help us navigate this broader context. And she's holds her own in geopolitical work and her work in innovation. So I think it was a true honor to bring her onto this episode, and that we actually got to film and record together at the Nobel Peace Center. I want to dive into what are the big questions to ask, and also what are the concrete actions we can do in our own lives. So, here to talk to us about responsibilities, tech, community, fostering hope, and shaping that better future is our guest and very special friend, Pardis Shafafi. She is an anthropologist practitioner who specializes in political violence and understanding of global social trends. Pardis has worked across diverse sectors, including the humanitarian sector as a senior arms and violence advisor in clinical care, as a nursing student in patient administration with design strategy and ethical practices at Designit, where she co-founded the Do No Harm for Design framework, and now as the head of marketing at the Social Gaming Group, which develops technology elevated games which encourages people to play together in real life.
And she's also on the board of the human rights organization Article 19. She's also the co-editor of the Anthropology in Action peer-reviewed journal and associate researcher with the EU offsite project at the Political Anthropology Lab at the CNRS in Paris. So we've got some exciting topics to dig in with her today. And so let's get started.
Woo! Can't wait to bring on Pardis.
Let's get
Welcome back on. We're re-recording this, take 2. So we're moving our discussion from inside the Nobel Peace Center here. Meryn and I did a reframe earlier today of this conversation, and it was really sort of around how this conversation is traversing innovation, impact, and personal agency, how we can show up in this world simultaneously that is advancing in so many rights. And the reason why we wanted you especially is because you work in these different fields of tech and innovation and design, things that are about advancing a progression and is showing a lot of advancement, like technology and innovation. But at the same time, you're working with, a lot of political humanitarian causes. So in our exploration today of these complexities, I just want to outright ask this big question first. Do you still find optimism, or do you still find a way forward in all of this?
Yeah, starting off strong. I think I have to say yes, because I think as a person who's engaged with politics, you can't ever stop. You can't start by saying you're out of optimism or you're out of steam, because that kind of, yeah, it's a little bit too nihilistic, I think, for my politics. But I will say it's not. I think I spent a long time championing the politics of hope and talking about like hope as this radical thing, and it just drives us forward, and we have a responsibility to be hopeful, and we just need to push through. And actually, I'm not sure that's where we are on a global political level right now, with the attention to the poly crises that are unfolding around us, and it's kind of live stream genocide that we're all witness to, willingly and unwillingly, and have a responsibility to be locked into. But I don't think we're in an age of politics of hope anymore. I think we're very much in an age of politics of resistance and finding creative ways of resisting moving forward. And I think the more I think about it, the more I relate it to this idea that, we are in a state of, I think, global mourning and global grief. I feel we're really, how do you say, as you say, traversing into a new era. And that necessarily comes with a sense of grief for the things that we've lost, or the ways of being and knowing that we may be connected to. Even things like the politics of hope, which, I really held on to. That was something it wasn't just like a strategy, it was a way of life, but actually kind of stopping for a moment and realizing, no, this is new. We need to actually, we need new tools to move forward. Some of the stuff that we leaned on, the institutions that we trusted, the kind of paradigms that we leaned into, those no longer serve us. I think that also calls for a sense of kind of collective mourning and grief.
Absolutely.
Grief.
And I think that's, when you started talking about this sort of this sense of, that hope is very fundamentally looking differently. It's the institutions that we held up as moral authorities in some capacity. We've seen that both that, our elected leaders who are supposed to represent us, force the systemic challenges that have always been there. But the chinks in the armor have become noticeable for every single person now. It's not just a global majority who have been considered a minority that have lost out on a political level. Now I think, and I wonder if that's why this global movement and this global mourning is, because it's and touching everyone's lives in some capacity.
Let's talk a little bit more about we're no longer in the politics of hope anymore and we're in the politics of resistance, because after our several conversations, that makes a lot of sense to me, but it all could be a little bit pessimistic, or because a lot of people say, oh, if we don't have hope, what do we have? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
I mean, I understand that it can come off as somewhat pessimistic, but I think it's more that it's not that you don't need hope. It's just I don't see hope as the kind of galvanizing force of progressive movements or movements to people who want to stand up against some of the kind of the horsemen of the kind of fascist apocalypse, essentially. I don't think hope is the thing that is at the front of this race anymore. I actually think that we are up against the wall a little bit and we need to hold the line. And I think we hold the line because we're hopeful that we can still do something, and that's still hope, but it's a different kind of hope. I think we're resisting rather than pushing forward with
And you talked about these small acts of resistance. You spoke previously about transnational feminism, about how we create a sense of community in small ways to resist. Can you talk more about, these kind of glimmers of, holding the line, essentially?
Yeah, I think there are lots of historical lessons in kind of darker times when we feel like politics takes a turn for to hardline politics to the right, to more kind of authoritarian and tighter kind of regimes. And what we learn from them is that the things that those regimes focus on eradicating are often the things that threaten them the most. And actually, if you look at neoliberal states, especially kind of neoliberal ideologies that we see most rapidly in the global north, what they seek to eradicate is care and community. And the reasons they do that is because care and community are often the antidotes to, or at least the biggest obstacles to falling in line with a right-wing agenda and a neoliberal agenda. And I mean, it's not a coincidence that both of these things are also associated with different ideas about the family. They also focus on often kind of wider notions of gender. They're often very kind of feminine concepts. The concept of care has been devalued at every single level. If you look at institutionalized care, if you look at family care, at every single level it's attacked. And then you need to ask the question, why is this so central to the kind of current crises? And I think there you find the places where you can enact also radical resistance of, actually, what we need to do is value care. What we need to do is value community. We need to push this up. We need to look outside of our nuclear families and care across our communities. And these radical acts of care, I think, are the antidote.
I think, yeah, you highlighting care and community being the antidote is just somewhat of a relief, because it seems like it's so easy. And I feel like I know after reading the news time and time again, it's care and community as an antidote is somewhat, it seems like a big thing that we should do on a global level, and it becomes this big, massive enabler. But at the same time, it seems very simple and intuitive to me, at least. And so now flipping over to, innovation and or technology, because they're sometimes equivalent but sometimes not, and we've talked about that as well, meaning, innovation doesn't always mean technology in my definition book, but does the advancement of, what we can do with digital, I even work with large industrial carbon capture technologies. Like, do any of these levels of technology give you hope or a feeling of empowerment? Does that mean anything? in this day and age and at the rise of AI?
I think I'm glad you you processed it into the different factors, because I think like technology as a big term, it's massive and it can mean anything. And I think ultimately it's a tool. When I've done talks on innovation and do no harm, we talk about, are we talking about a bread knife or a spanner? What problem are you trying to fix with it, and how are you going about to do it? Different tools do different things and they have different potential risks and outcomes. But when with generative AI, which is often what we're talking about these days, that's the main focus of the talk about technology. We're discussing again everything from epidemic preparedness and developing models to be able to evolve vaccines much faster than we did in the last in the last outbreak. Or we're talking about technology, image generation technology, which helps teenagers to produce pornographic images non-consensually of their schoolmates. So it's, like for what, in whose hands, for what purpose is often needs to accompany that. But the broad maybe paradigm I really want people to engage with more than anything is that we start by asking what can it do, and very rarely do we follow that up with who do we want to be at the end of this. Like we erase so much useful friction in this endless search for efficiency. And that's essentially what technology has started to do more and more. And working in design for like 6-7 years now, I saw it at every level with products and services. So, digital and analog, even public services and social innovation, they're looking for efficiency as an outcome. And whenever you're looking for efficiency rather than a social outcome, a change, the result is that sometimes you trample over this useful friction, this learning that we need as human beings to get better. And I would argue that's different scales of learning than when you're using Gen AI to develop a model for vaccines than it is for social services and outreach programs. You need that constant friction, that constant micro conflicts, those moments where, you really need to understand people in tough situations to learn, to grow, to adapt the service. And you lose that by erasing the person or by implementing a technology that just makes it go faster. Faster isn't better. And that tends to become the central question whenever I'm discussing at least social innovation and Gen AI. And I think it's useful for everybody. What do we lose when we stop learning? It's almost like when you're back at school and you're doing maths, okay, most of us are going to be pretty crappy at maths in the next few years, I guess, because nobody's doing maths in their head anymore, right? But it's always that thing of like, if you don't show you're working out, then you're not showing that you're learning, and then you don't learn, and then you just skip to the end, and we become people who relate to each other with quick fixes and shortcuts, and not really having engaged with the complexity of what it is to be human. So that's the kind of answer to that question.
And I think it comes back to what you said about like asking the question first and foremost, like, why are we doing this? Who are we doing it for, and why?
Yeah.
It was about a decade ago now, I went to the Stanford D School and, sort of got the background context into how they built the school and why. And again, when you go to Silicon Valley, you've got all these inspiring innovators, but they're always working from a place of how are we innovating to improve a process and cut out middlemen. And it just kind of flies in the face of going, well, what is the impact of this? Who are we doing it for? And I think, a lot of it is building shareholder wealth. It's like we're cutting out processes along the way so that there are certain people who can amass more. So the value, the connectedness, all of these things that we talk about that are also associated with community, it often comes back to that. Having a relationship with the person who's, doing your shopping with you, or it doesn't have to be necessarily checkouts, but just, these things that create this interconnectedness and this sense of social fabric that we're there for one another through technology can either be empowered or they can be slowly diminished away. And we see that happening more and more, which I find if we're not thinking about what is the answer we want and working back from that answer and asking why are we building it, then I think just we're going to continue steaming in the direction of building shareholder wealth. And as that amasses, that's then connected to government politics and tax breaks and job growth and all of these kinds of things that are pushing society in the direction that it is.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And I don't know if you've read this book by Aaron Bastani, who is one of the founders of Novara Media, this alternative media outlet in the UK, but he wrote a book called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. And
Mm.
he basically imagined the world, and this is, I mean, it must be about 10 years old by now. And so he wrote it when Elon Musk was like a good guy. He was like a visionary guy. So you can see like people have really, their public personas have changed. And I'm sure some of the meanings have changed. But one of the things that he put forward, which I thought was really kind of shouldn't be novel or original, but which was really good, was also, why do we assume on the left of, neoliberal, I would say, why do we assume that technology is always going to mean less good kind of labor rights? Why do we think it will mean diminished kind of quality of life for workers in general, when we can also, if we just let our political imagination kind of really take over for a while, which I know we've also enjoyed talking about in the past, if we really innovate on this, actually, if we don't need to work to sustain life, if we don't need to, put 8 hours of our day towards creating intellectual or other kinds of output, what else could we do? Like, because then we just need to look at how to create a sustainable model for us to exist without working. And what he says is, is that so bad? Isn't that exactly what communism wanted to do? You know what I mean? Which is like, have we not just maybe cracked this whole thing of maybe we should be making art and like reading poetry and trying to fix the climate crisis, and maybe, not doing what David Graeber called, bullshit jobs, going into offices
Absolutely.
and
Oh,
doing things that don't really
this
matter.
is
And I thought that was really like, that's also a way, but it requires people to engage with it and actually take it seriously and enact it, right?
But don't you think that's probably one of the hardest things to do now, is to disassociate some of the ideologies from like the quick judgment of
100%.
from the US? I can tell you, and maybe you know this, any hint of socialism,
Yeah.
the image that comes straight to people's head is like long lines around a bakery waiting for your turn to grab your loaf of bread.
And
Yeah, so
that's like one of the world's best funded, both in terms of persecution and in terms of, propaganda, best funded kind of campaigns. Not
absolutely.
because every other, I mean, I think we're not here to kind of defend one or the other binary. I think we're beyond binary ideologies at this point. Like, it's 2025. We should be able to take what we think works and, apply things without being afraid of being called one thing or the other. But I do think when you look at the history of PR and political marketing, which came about just after the Great Depression, weirdly, stop me if you know this, but the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who went to the US, and he started a PR firm, which wasn't called PR then. I think he kind of invented the field. His name was Edward Bernays. And the idea was that he was trying to make people in the US buy things again after the Great Depression, because people were not buying things. They had scarcity mindset. Everybody was mending. And actually now, production was starting to increase, and they needed to make people think like they needed things. So he started marketing. He started advertising as we know it now, which is telling people, this pair of stockings, is actually it's much better than the ones that you've been mending 50 times. Actually, you should buy these new ones because they'll make you feel like this or that. And he took his uncle's kind of, you say his thinking, basically his approach, and he used that to talk to people inside. Basically, you're talking to their inner sense of identity, and he turned that into what we know now to be PR marketing. But that was very quickly co-opted by the political class, who understood, aha, we should use this to get people to vote one way or the other. If we kind of tell them that this particular political candidate represents their views more because, and actually using that as an advertising kind of platform more than talking about their policies, for example, right? So I think the link between these two, it's been discussed like ad nauseum for years and years, but when you look at the roots of physical marketing and how it literally came from the same person who invented advertising based on his uncle's kind of co-opting his uncle's psychological theories, which worked, it tells you a lot about why we feel certain ways and why those camps emerge so strongly, because actually we're looking at legacies of political marketing. We've just been bombarded for years and years and years. And, arguably people could also say, both sides have been bombarded with this, but I would say at least somewhat, not always, but at least that there are a substantial number of people on the progressive left and in what used to be called the center who've been trying to maintain the line, who've been trying to hold the line of, some kind of clean politics. And when I say grief and mourning, I think those people are the ones that are probably grieving and mourning, because those people who were upholding institutions, human rights law, the humanitarian work, these kind of what Didier Fasson called the international moral community, who will keep us above descending into chaos and crises. Those are the people who I think have been most affected now by the Wizard of Oz, falling of the curtain. See, oh, well, we're protesting, but nothing happens. What do we do now? Basically, those institutions have failed us. And actually, the political marketing on some level has won.
And I think what you say about, just we need to think in more nuanced ways about political or like political governance. We need to think in different ways about economic models. I think it's so interesting that going back to what you say about political marketing is really forcing people in you've got this ideology or that. And that wasn't the case. Back in the 50s, there was bipartisan agreement on universal base income in the US, which like today you can't even imagine something like that being the case. And it's like there were so many ways, and so was the 4-day work week. There were ideologies that were again bipartisan, that were very much in this kind of like, okay, well, we know the advancement of technology is going to free up time to do other kinds of things. And there were tests which were hidden away in archives about the success of these kinds of programs. And I think also to your point around the bullshit jobs, when you've got this, the morale has just completely sort of dropped from the center and, as you say, the progressive left. I wonder, because now, and especially with Palestine just opening up an understanding of like, oh shit, okay, we're all seeing now, we have to do something. More people who have never protested before are out of the streets. How do we get these people who, are probably in some kind of what, the term is bullshit jobs, into a strategic place of care? And I think back to your question, Valerie, on like, where is the optimism with? Is it, in terms of breaking down innovation or, as an individual, or as a collective in business or otherwise, to think about the amount of people who have bullshit jobs, who could actually go, maybe with my insight into the way government institutions work, or maybe the thing that I do in a commercial context for a bank could be used to change the world, fix the climate, so on and so forth. And I'm wondering why we're not asking more questions like this in light of everyone feeling, or so many people now feeling so helpless, because that sort of switch and that collective sort of communion. I mean, if the people who have traditionally benefited from the system are now seeing the breakdown of that system, it's like, how do we mobilize them as well?
Well, the good thing is that, I mean, there's a really good book and project by Rutger Bregman exactly on this called Moral Ambition. You might know him. He's the he's a very cool guy. A Dutch historian who has taken a lot of the world's kind of powerful to task. And that's kind of what he's doing. He's kind of trying to mobilize people away from using their skill set and their intelligence and their time and labor from, these kind of bullshit jobs, or at least jobs that are not necessarily contributing towards improving the conditions of life. He's saying, if we all pulled these resources away and put them towards a bigger project, think of the things that we can do. And I think he definitely has a point. I think a lot of people in bullshit jobs don't know that they're working in bullshit jobs. That's what I would say. And I think there's another thing. I'm talking about the politics of care, I think is really important in this, because the relationship to labor has changed, of course, after COVID, when I think a lot of workers realized that their bosses and their workplaces didn't care about them, right? So, and that was a break in a sense of care and a kind of care contracts that people had internationally with a place of work, at least certain people. And I think that carelessness is now being mobilized against people through social media, through algorithms, because we're being hosed down with so many things, and this idea that you should really focus on your nuclear family, your immediate, your workplace, your 9 to 5, and then the life that you have around that, and that you're so busy and you're so overwhelmed that you couldn't possibly do anything more. And I think it's really important to think about that, because we're being taught carelessness, or we're being fed carelessness, and it's a sedative. Also a way of turning away and thinking, well, I couldn't possibly do anything. I'm too exhausted, and my attention's gone. I'm frazzled after a day of staring at my phone and the screen. So I can't do anything. So going back to this idea that look at the places that are being targeted, and it's exactly those places that we should be kind of turning around. I think care is that place. And again, relationship to labor, maybe not with typical labor in a kind of in the way we might have had pre-COVID, but maybe in the way that Bergman talks about. Maybe it's more about small spaces of resistance within our jobs as well as outside of that in other things, because not everybody is privileged enough to just say, well, I'll just job and I'll go and wander into the forest and write a book about all the things I know. It's I wish we could all do that, but we can't.
Yeah, I was thinking that as well. And you mentioned like a lot of people who have bullshit jobs, like they don't know it. Maybe that's a part of the population. And then you've got the part that maybe they know, but they are sort of stuck in the rat's race and they can't get it. Seeing technology that makes us more efficient, I mean, namely Gen AI, even though the way it's being used right now is, oh, it makes you more efficient. So great, now go do some more stuff. Rather than that version, the other is you can free yourself up and have that time for the care and nurturing of community. I'm actually quite hopeful that's a possibility for how I can live my life, but it saddens me at the same time. I mean, not to be naive, it saddens me that, we can sit here talking about this, but we work with people who would strongly disagree, and refute that. Like, if they free up the time, and then seeing that even with such technology that could help us and get us to this somewhat of a better place. I wouldn't say utopia, but somewhat of a better place in this world. That's not where we choose to spend our time. It sort of disappoints me at the same time. It still feels like a double-edged sword.
And I think going back to what you said about when you recognize and you start talking about how fascism makes you turn and it makes you focus on your small part of the world and you start losing sight of others. Just knowing that and having the language to say an act of resistance is going out to community, it's that sense of connectedness. Like, not only is it a resistance in the form of just because care feels like a scarce resource, and it also does in the sense that when you go outside of your bubble, the less homogeneous you are, the more you understand the people around you.
But you made me think of something, because and Valerie, you talk about this double-edged sword thing, and I think that it's really good to be able to hold those two kind of levels of complexity at once. Because, for example, when we talk about learning about people who are different from us, right? The Turing Institute in the UK, they did a study that showed that people are more likely to engage in a more kind of vulnerable way about tough questions on race and racism, and asking difficult questions to the chat GPT more often than not to learn about these things, and that would be more likely to change their minds about some of the assumptions that they had about people who are different from them than talking to a person about it, where they would feel judged and afraid, and maybe wouldn't even open themselves up to those kinds of questions. But then my question is, does that make them question their racist assumptions full stop, or does that get them out of the house and actually talking to a person of a different background? Like, I solve I've questioned my assumptions. You've necessarily moved beyond that through, ChatGPT does that kind of work. Again, it reduces that friction, and the friction is uncomfortable. And actually, I'm a big believer, and you have to be in that discomfort. I grew up in a really, really multicultural part of London, very close to where Notting Hill Carnival is happening. Actually, it happened today and yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the Caribbean community, lots of people from West Africa, a few Middle Eastern people, very few people from the dominant kind of English background that you would comes to mind. And I learned, and everybody else around me learned through very uncomfortable conversations growing up, what was okay and what wasn't okay. because we tested each other's boundaries when we were young enough to be able to do that, when everybody was kind of like, you were kind of, maybe you were a little bit less sensitive to being told, oh, actually, that's not fun for me. And actually, I don't like it when you do that. And this joke didn't land very well because da da da. And you have to have those moments of discomfort. And then you get older and you're kind of like, oh, I just kind of know these general rules,
Yeah.
right? But I don't know them because somebody has told me this is not okay to say, which is what I think happens more often than not now. And this is often the reaction of, especially, boomers and even Gen X and millennials like me, this kind of, this is okay and this isn't okay, but that why? What happens when you get it wrong? How do you
Mm,
move through the uncomfortable moment when you get it wrong?
yeah,
How do you continue the conversation instead of just breaking that relation? Those kinds of moments of discomfort and friction are completely erased. And
yeah.
then we're happy with, oh, well, people will just ask ChatGPT the uncomfortable questions. So nobody ever has to, have that conversation. I
Yeah.
think we lose something there.
It's so interesting because I was reading an article on this very thing, on Carnival, and just the increase in monoculture and our lack of ability to be able to have those connecting conversations and have this sort of multiculture as a word of like multi, um, versus mono, like we all have to sort of behave and act way. And it talked also about something that Valerie and I have talked about, like cancel culture. Like as soon as you say the wrong thing, like goodbye, you're rude. So there's so much less, there's much less of a uh, threshold to say the wrong thing, fuck up, and then get cancelled. So we have this kind of trepidation to get uncomfortable as well because we think that our reputation is going to be
Mm.
badly compromised. And reading books like White Tears and well, I'm not no longer talking to white people about race and the sort of like, if we keep turning it on ourselves and going, well, I didn't mean this and then I'm therefore making it about me, we lose sight of being able to have really authentic conversations and actually fall on our swords. Like politicians do it every day. They fall on their swords and they get back up and they just like keep fucking up the world. It's like, this should give us a bit of perspective in terms of just like the ability to humble ourselves and reconnect and come from that place of like, I'm just genuinely sorry that I fucked up and, I want to do better and I'm curious and I want to learn is something that I
Or
hope
I
we do.
didn't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I
I didn't know any
genuinely
better.
didn't know.
No, I
Yeah.
learned. I'm sorry. And actually, going back to this technology thing, I think it's also the cancel culture side of it and the way that we punish, but also don't really give people space necessarily to come back from it. And I say we because I think everybody should take responsibility for it. And I don't blame, I think, of course, this is not a kind of woke issue. I think this is a social media and algorithm issue, actually, more than
Mhm.
anything. This is a pylon issue.
Mm.
And one of the reasons it happens is because our sense of identity is so much more curated. And going back to what technology has done to us and how it gets in the way of our political organizing, because political organizing is messy and it's inconvenient and it's not Instagrammable. If you've ever been to a community kind of organizing forum, you'll know that sometimes it's long and boring and sometimes it's really like full of tension and emotions, because politics is full of tension and emotions. And we've been fed this sanitized kind of curated idea of how change looks, and it's beautiful. And we all laughed when Kendall gave the Pepsi to the police officer in the ad, right? But actually, on some level, I think we're all told the moment of change and transformation will look a bit like that. It will be this kind of grand
Mm.
gesture, and actually, it's not. It's little inconvenient, conversations with your neighbor who's asked you to do a favor and you're really tired and you actually just don't want to do it, but you're going to do it anyway.
Do it
You know,
anyway.
Yeah.
it's like you're not immune to making a mistake because you're also, you come from a minority background. I'm like, and that's what I was trying to growing up in the Caribbean community. I made plenty of mistakes and I was corrected sometimes with love, sometimes not with love. And I think you also have to respect that, you've triggered someone and okay, I've overstepped and I'll never forget it, and I'll never forget that lesson. And equally, somebody took the time and the care to correct me and guide me through it. And I also never forgot that. And it's complex. We're complex people. And of course, there's a history of microaggressions and you're not always in the headspace and you don't always have to be generous and forgiving.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some conversations where maybe you can think, I'm invested in moving past this. And can I do that? And it doesn't mean in that moment, hugging it out or doing something that you're not comfortable with. But I have been in conversations where I say to people, hey, actually, what you're saying, it could be taken really badly. But I really respect you, and I know that you didn't mean it that way. So if you're okay with it, I'd like to tell you why that could
Mm.
have been taken badly.
Oh
Mhm.
yeah.
And then if you're open to it, and we can move on. And I remember going to a party, and a really good friend of mine, who I hope will listen to this podcast and remember this conversation. We had a really strange conversation where he made a really offhand remark that I was like, oh, and I just kind of corrected him what I thought in a kind of light-hearted way. And he
Mm.
didn't appreciate it at all. And I remember, like, and we're still really good friends, and we spent the party kind of sitting on opposite ends of the room. And I remember, like, a mutual friend of us just kind of moving between us and being like, guys, seriously, like, just let it go. Like, it wasn't that big a deal. And I was just like, no, it was a big deal. Or it wasn't a big deal until he refused to be corrected. And then it kind of escalated. And in the evening, of course, like, we made up, and we decided to laugh at it afterwards. But there was a moment where it was high tension. And if one of us had walked out, or if one of us had just said, well, that's the end of it, I'm not sure the interaction was worth the entire
Mm.
relationship, is my
Mm.
point. I think when we talk
Oh,
about care and community,
Agree.
that's the kind of relation we make.
you touched on, social media, and that kind of goes into modern day media, what journalists are reporting on. We just have to touch on that briefly because you work a lot on that. And you've also mentioned that, I don't know if you want this on air, but you've mentioned that you've lost friends over journalistic integrity. I mean, can you just
Yeah, I mean, my approach to this, I guess, is that especially in the last 3 to 4 years, where we've seen, I think, higher than average or higher than ever before, rates of kind of political violence beamed directly into our phones and into our kind of Instagram feeds. It was at that point I really expected the kind of the mainstream media, or definitely representatives of mainstream media outlets, certainly the ones that I knew, but beyond that, kind of internationally, to represent a changed perspective or take a stand, whether collectively or, as outlets. I expected something. I expected a gesture, because it became very clear very quickly. The scale of citizen reporting kind of told us everything we needed to know. Why are we
Mhm.
getting most of our news and images directly from the ground in the places where people are actually being killed as they're recording? We're talking about, I'm talking specifically about Iran with the women life freedom protests, but equally Palestine, which has been ongoing for 2 years. And in the first
Mm.
months following October 7th, what I heard from journalists was that they couldn't verify the news fast enough. Then I heard that they couldn't possibly feature violence of that caliber on mainstream kind of sites. They couldn't get journalists on the ground. There were so many reasons for why they couldn't cover this news directly where it was happening.
Mm.
And I think now that there's been a bit of a watershed moment, and a lot of mainstream outlets have, they haven't publicly owned up to it, but they've certainly changed somewhat in the way that they're reporting on this, and the attention that they're giving to it. But after whistleblowing accounts from the BBC, from The Guardian, even from Norwegian outlets
Mm.
to different extents, I'm still waiting for that big gesture. And I think it tells you, for me at least, it tells me everything I need to know about what journalism means these days. And that's the question I'm left with. What does journalism mean? Who is a journalist now? Is it a
Mm.
person that studied and, took some kind of, is it a vocation where you've aligned yourself with getting the truth out and reporting on
Mm.
important things, educating the public on what's going on in the world? Or are you clocking in and clocking out and creating soft clickbait media under the guise of, journalism, which is approved by an editor with a non-transparent set of decision-making processes around what makes the news and what doesn't make the news? And this has definitely strained my relationships, because I think I kind of bought and somewhat kind of sympathized with the difficult situation for journalists, and the way that outlets and the business model around outlets is currently kind of going. But I think with Palestine, looking at, more journalists have been killed in Palestine than any of the world wars combined. And I'm like, and still I don't see a protest. I think where
Mm.
it's certainly in Norway, I'm still waiting. I'm like, your colleagues, where's your sense of solidarity with your colleagues?
Mm.
The doctors came out, the university students came out, the professors came out. Where's the solidarity amongst journalists? And that really left me with a bad taste in my mouth. And it also made me ask a lot of bigger questions about the media and the business model. What's feeding what? Is the business model feeding the mission? or is the mission feeding the business model? And I'm left feeling deeply disappointed and hoping that there is a transformation on the way. And I think, just saying, I'm not a pessimist. I do think it is on the way now. I think, I don't think we should have paid for it in Palestinian blood, but I think that the recent targeting of the Al Jazeera crew, we saw actually more and more visible warning of journalists around the world. Mexico, in the UK, so something is shifting, something is changing, not fast enough, I think. And
Yeah, and
I wish people
like
didn't need to die for that to happen.
it feels that the shift is happening, but it's like before that shift really becomes seismic, it's a hold the line situation. But I think it could become the shift that we're looking for, because collectively we see that the system is so broken that it needs to change. And we need more, thinkers from all sides on that systemic change. Seeing like extreme right wing conservative journalists in the US standing up for Palestine now, and been absolutely flawed. But at the same time, well, the world is waking up, and despite my pessimism or my those people and the belief that they sprout, it's like it's seismic, and it just comes back to the point of like looking at all these glimmers of hope as we're progressing, like we're trying to progress is one thing, but strategy, going back to what you said, is just connect with your fellow neighbor, or
With your mission,
with
with your
community.
craft. Journalism is a craft. It was a craft of truth.
It
In
was,
Norway, they call it what is it, the fourth pillar or something of society. I'm like,
It feels like,
how is
why
this?
so Hippocratic oath for journalists? There should have been something like that of like, okay, there's a certain level of integrity in terms of how you report the truth, but instead, Rupert Murdoch created a trend where like, oh, if we get the money that we have from advertisers, it means that they can influence and shape the way that we write the news, essentially, and that model's being copied. And from the smallest local, what's the word, the local newspaper to big global.
It's kind of it's a very neat segue back to political marketing, because then when is it journalism and when is it political marketing? And actually, when it owns the media outlets and how the kind of the business model is fed, the question becomes, modern day journalism, does it just produce modern day political marketing?
And now we just have to get back to the biggest antidote that came up, which was the small acts of resistance. And I think we're all feeling that personally at work and, on a political level, what we can do and what we can influence to affect politicians locally. Pardis, what's like the small acts of resistance that you would personally do, or you can, encourage others to do or think of?
So kind of really hammering away at this idea of care, I'd say like show up for people outside of your immediate family, especially your local neighborhood and your community, really kind of not just communities in terms of shared interests, but local communities, I think are really important to invest in. So that's everything from trying to put your money in these spaces, but also, sharing resources, helping people, spending time with people outside of your kind of normal bubble. The second is really practical, is put your money into alternative media, support media outlets that are operating on a different model. Don't just donate to humanitarian and rights causes. They're very important and you should absolutely keep doing that, but also really think about the thing that keeps you informed. Put money into their projects. And I mean that's really, really important. And there are lots of organizations like that. There's Progressive International. Jacobin does a fantastic job of different kind of podcasts and outreach programs. Novara Media's out there. Zetland, I mentioned last time, is out there kind of operating on a completely new media model. They're investing in bringing you good quality fact check news to educate you, to inform you, to elevate your thinking and challenge you a little bit, not just to kind of feed you slop. And I think going forward, that's going to make the biggest difference, especially, I'm just going to squeeze in this one study at the University of Newcastle, which is the trend that should make everyone happy, is that consumers are moving away from things that do not align with their values and they're voting with their wallets. And the good businesses and organizations are taking this to heart and improving the way they do business and, leading with more values-based outcomes, processes, and of course, marketing. And the ones that do not do that are of course finding ways to spin their projects and how they operate. And I would say be critical and find the difference and put your money where it hurts the right organizations and where it helps the right ones.
Absolutely. Like you can just see the CEO of Target stepping down because of the repeal of the DEI initiatives that landed incredibly flatly. So I think just the collective power of people to be able to vote with their wallets means everything right now.
Meryn, do you have?
I think it's always different. Like, how do we re-find our shared humanity in a digital age with everything going on? And I think just that the micro inclusions, micro resistances in general, at least for me, they look different kind of from week to week because I don't know, as an entrepreneur, like sometimes my energy levels are like flying high and other times they're through the floor. So I think I'm not someone who can just sort of like, I don't have a regular routine, at least now. So I'm like, okay, well, where do I get out and connect with, whether it is people in my neighborhood, or I also think, with the skills and resources I have, I can be a part of helping grassroots organizations. I can use my business brain to be able to nudge and shape how a leader sort of creates an impact within an organization. And I think all of these things, for me at least, I'm always trying to think on a really big scale, but now I'm just like, just calm down and just nudge. Like you just nudge in the right direction and it's going to make a difference. So I think just nudging where you have influence and connection. Valerie?
Both. I'm gonna keep it at the wisdom that both of you shared. I love the reminders. So thank you, Pardis, for coming on to our Peace of Mind pop-up.
Thanks for having me.
Nice.
Bye.
If you've enjoyed our podcast so far, please hit the 5 stars rating wherever you get your podcast. And more importantly, share it with a friend. It helps us tremendously. And find us on Instagram and LinkedIn at Modern Idealist Podcast.